So Brian Bledsoe again here with your December update, and a lot to talk about, especially during the early part of this forecast, which I will get to in more detail here in just a moment. But really looking backwards here for the past 30 days or so, there really haven't been a great deal of storm systems moving through that have been terribly impactful. We have pretty good stripe of snow that made its way up through the eastern two-thirds of Kansas, and it largely missed the far southeast corner. Most areas farther to the south across Oklahoma, back into Texas, have obviously been a little bit drier than average, especially the eastern third of Texas over the past 30 days or so. But things are starting to change a little bit in terms of the overall weather pattern. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to benefit everybody, but I do think it's going to benefit some folks, as you'll see here as we advance through the forecast period, which I think is really important over the next 2 weeks. Here it is on Sunday evening at about 4 o'clock, and I'm looking at a storm system that is going to largely impact many parts of the region starting Wednesday and continuing through Thursday, Friday, and finally getting out of the forecast picture by the time Saturday rolls around of this next week. And you could see the precipitation anomalies that are in the forecast for the next 2 weeks. Now, a lot of that green and blue you see there across the majority of Texas, creeping up into southwest Kansas, western Oklahoma, even eastern New Mexico, is largely going to be tied to this initial storm system that's coming through. But I think it's important to note that this is kind of the start of more of an active weather pattern that we've been kind of advertising now over the past couple of months. If you remember, I've been pretty much on board with folks in December seeing fairly active weather coming in from the west and the southwest, and this initial storm system could certainly deliver some significant moisture to some areas that have grossly been lacking for not only the past 30 days, but really for about the past 3 to 4 months across the region. And I think across, if for Kansas especially, I think the southwest and the south central part of the state probably have the best shot, but really the farther south you go across a large part of Texas, this storm system is definitely going to put some water on the ground. The next 45 days, again, if you look where that green and blue is largely prevailing across southwest Kansas and farther south through western portions of Texas and eastern New Mexico, I really think that this first storm system is going to be responsible for that big boost in moisture. But as I've been saying, I really think over the next month and a half or so, there will be additional storms come through that can not only benefit the region that this initial storm is going to benefit, but maybe areas farther to the east and to the northeast. Initially, I'm looking at this stuff across eastern Oklahoma and into the Mississippi River Valley, saying, man, they are really dry there. But again, I think that might be tied to the dryness that they're experiencing now, not necessarily tied to the pattern that they may benefit from a little bit later on. But I feel pretty good about a large part of the western high plains getting some moisture, at least in the near term, which is a good thing. Update here as far as our El Nino situation is concerned. This is what our current sea surface temperature anomalies look like. Again, we've got the warm ENSO region of the El Nino that's going on right now there that I have ovaled off the west coast of South America. Over here to the west in the Indian Ocean, we also have a very warm Indian Ocean right there. And at the same time, those two regions are warm. We have the cold PDO or the negative PDO that's still prevailing there from the Gulf of Alaska off the west coast of the United States out toward Hawaii. That kind of cooler than average horseshoe that's going on right there that's still prevailing. But in terms of the El Nino that's going on right now, it is still present. The overall pattern that is associated with the El Nino likely maxes out here in the next month or so, and then it'll start to go away. And I will talk much more about that coming up here in a little while. But our sea surface temperature anomaly forecast for January, again, you see all the oranges and the reds there off the west coast of South America that really reflects the current status of the El Nino that's going to persist through January. If we look beyond January and go into March, you can see that the El Nino really starts to fade away during that time frame. So as I've been saying, the El Nino maxes out here during the middle part of winter and then goes out during the back part of winter and before we hit spring, because by the time we even push into the month of June, you see it's gone away. And the thing that's important to note here, you see the little bit of blue that's starting to show up there off the west coast of South America. That is largely the transition that I've been, really talking about now for the past several months, that once this El Nino goes away, the likelihood that La Nina starts to get its foothold and come back is a pretty strong likelihood at that. I really don't see that changing, and I'll share that animation with you here at the end of our forecast presentation that really kind of drives that point home. In the near term, though, the MJO remains very active. Remember, the El Nino or the La Nina can set the table in terms of the pattern that is to be expected, but the MJO is the thing that really delivers the meal. Again, the Madden-Julian oscillation is that element of the long-range forecast in the 30 to 60-day time frame that really is responsible for what we get. And you see over here on the graph to the right, the colored lines especially cycling through these different phases, but really prevailing over here in region 7, 8, and 1, especially from now really through the early part of January, by about the 5th of January. So when the MJO was locked into that side of the globe, these are generally the kind of composites that you see with that. So these are the precipitation composites for December, January, February that we historically see when the MJO is locked into these phases. And you can see your particular phase over here, phase 1 in the upper left, and then 7 and 8 down here on the lower right, that where you see the green, that's where the precipitation is more prevalent. Where you see the browns, especially the darker browns, that's where it's drier than average. And I really think it's these MJO phases, not only the individual phases that they're in, but the fact that it is cycling that's really important to keeping our weather pattern variable, not only during December, January, February, but also January, February, and March. As long as we have the MJO continuing to move through these phases, but largely prevail in 7, 8, and 1, we're going to keep not only the midsection of the country fairly active, but also the southwest part of the country fairly active as these storm systems continue to move in. So you're going to hear me talk a lot about the MJO going forward, and that's the reason why, because it's really important that we keep the MJO not only active, but moving through these various phases to keep our weather pattern not only variable, but hoping to capitalize on some of these storms. This is the latest Euro-seasonal model precipitation forecast for the month of January. So again, where you're seeing the greens, that's where it's wetter than average. The browns, drier than average. Again, for January, you could see Nebraska, Kansas, lit up there with the green. A little bit drier the farther south you go during the month of January. I'm not necessarily totally sold on that just yet, especially if you look out there to the west with California ended up being active. Because if we flip and go from January to February, you see a lot of green on the map there, all the way from southern and western Texas up through Kansas, even southeast Nebraska. California stays active. That continues to indicate to me that storms are coming in not only through California, but they're pushing through the south and the southwest portion of the country. If we look at March, again, the latest model runs have kind of dried things out maybe a little bit across parts of east and southeast Kansas, down through eastern Oklahoma and back through west Texas. But we're keeping things active in Colorado, in western parts of Nebraska. So I'm not ready to completely sign off on those areas that are right next to those more active areas necessarily being drier than average during that time frame. So as I said, it's largely tied to how active the weather pattern continues to be through the course of winter and spring. Because if we head into April, again, average to slightly drier than average, depending on where you're located here through the midsection of the country, is the way to go. But nothing huge sticks out to me that said it's just going to be a complete shutout during that time. I still think we're going to keep the pattern pretty active through April. May, again, we light things up across the midsection of the country, again, across Texas, even up through parts of central and northeast Kansas on the Midwest. We have a little bit of dryness kind of squeezed in there between those two wet areas across Oklahoma and the eastern Texas panhandle. Again, why that's there, and we have active north and active south, not entirely sure. It may just be a model glitch and whatnot, something that I know we're going to sort out over the coming days for sure. And then if we look into June, this is when things start to become more interesting to me, because as the El Nino departs and La Nina starts to come in, there's a pretty significant drier than average flavor there to this particular model, not only across the western half of Kansas, but down into western Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico. And that is something that historically would be accurate. By that, I'm saying when a La Nina is present as we head into summer, that part of the country is usually drier than average. But here's the deal about this. If we put moisture in the ground with storm systems during the winter, and if we head into early spring, the dryness or the drought, I guess, impact that would start to set in kind of gets pushed farther down the road during that time frame as we work on the moisture that's already in the ground. So I'm not going to sign off on this just yet, at least for June. I think it's something that we need to pay attention to because it's there, but I'm still at least fairly optimistic before June. After June, that's a different story. Let's look at the NMME model here for the month of January. Again, we've got California showing up as being active, a little bit of dryness there across parts of the Central Plains, including east and southeast Kansas, down in Oklahoma and the Texas Panhandle. If we look at February, kind of the same story, really, some dryness in that area, which is a little bit of contrast to what we showed you with the Euro just a second ago. If we go to March, again, we light things up a little bit across West Texas, eastern New Mexico, Colorado. Most of Kansas, I guess, would be quote unquote in the average because it's just white, a little bit of a dry signal there across the southeast part of the state. If we look at April, wetter than average, pretty much across the midsection of the country. As I said, I think the weather patterns will still be fairly active as we head into the spring months. If we look at May, this is when I start to become more concerned because you see a ribbon of dryness starting to extend from south central through west Texas, eastern Oklahoma, and clipping south central and southeast Kansas. This is the thing that I'm a little bit more concerned about as the El Nino goes away and La Nina probably starts to take hold because for the month of June, a very stout dry signal starts to show up there in the midsection of the country, much like what the Euro seasonal model showed you just a second ago. So, as I've said for a long time now, I haven't necessarily been worried about things before June. But from June onward, that's when I became more concerned because the influence of the El Nino would be gone and our sea surface temperatures anomalies in the Pacific would start to go the opposite way. And even into July, we still have that dry signal that's still somewhat present there across the midsection of the country from eastern Colorado, west and southern portions of Kansas, back into New Mexico. So it's definitely something that we're going to have to babysit in the next couple of months to see how this is going to unfold when we go into the late spring and especially into summer. We look at the CFS model. Again, this model gets a little bit out of hand in terms of the amount of precipitation that's forecast, but it still has a lot of wetter than average conditions across the midsection of the country for January, February, and March across all of Kansas, down into Oklahoma and Texas. And again, I keep talking about things regionally because it's very important that we put moisture in the ground regionally to fix the dryness that could potentially take shape over the entire region. So I don't want you to just focus on your individual area and say this is the only thing that's important. It's important that you not only get moisture where you obviously are, but regionally. That goes a long way into keeping dryness and drought at bay. For March, April, May, again, this is a really wet signal across all of the western half of Kansas down through Oklahoma and Texas. And then if we progress May, June, July, that wet signal starts to migrate farther north. This is what I'm focused on as the transition or the handoff, if you will, from a potentially wet late winter and spring to drying things out thereafter. I think it's crucial that we put that moisture in the ground while this El Nino is here, because once it leaves, that's when my trepidation really starts to come on. The IRA multi-model ensemble, December, January, February. One more model to look at here keeps things active across the west and the southwest. You can see that ribbon of green extending into western Kansas right there. And then if we look at Feb, March, and April, you see it's on board with wetter than average conditions across the western third of Kansas, down into western Oklahoma, Texas, eastern Colorado. Again, indicating to me that storms are going to be coming in from the west and the southwest and keeping the weather pattern not only variable, but with frequent moisture producing storms coming in that we need to capitalize on. I think that's really the key point right there. The one thing that I had mentioned for a long time now is the PDO. The Pacific Decadal Oscillation still is very negative. This is since 2020, and you can see how negative it's been really over the past 3 years. And even over here on the far right side, that was the November reading that was just at about, I think, a negative 1.7 or 1.8, 1.78, I should say. And that's still very negative in terms of the PDO value. And it's not only very negative in terms of the PDO value, it's very negative in terms of the PDO value while we have an El Nino going on. I think that's the thing to really keep in mind. And as I've said, if we don't turn the PDO neutral or positive while this El Nino is here, and we keep the PDO negative, it makes it really easy for us to slip back into La Nina once this El Nino is out of here. And this is the latest sea surface temperature anomaly forecast from the Canadian model. I want you to watch this oval-shaped area here off the west coast of South America, and the animation will start again here in the upper right It'll start in January. Very warm with the El Nino going on, but watch that El Nino fade and watch the blue shading replace those warmer colors, indicating that La Nina is coming back here. Likely, if we roll it back again, the CANSIPS model right here actually brings that El Nino back into the fray, probably by May, certainly by June, and then thereafter, it's still holding in there during the back part of 2024. So I think that's one big thing to keep in mind here, that we're really going to transition things here in 24, where we start with an El Nino and see that El Nino depart in the first few months of 2024, and then see that La Nina come back. And that's what I've been especially concerned about, dryness taking shape, very late in the spring, but especially summer and into the back part of next year. So I think those are some things that we really need to plan for going forward. We obviously need to capitalize on the moisture that we get out of these storm systems, especially with this storm that's going to be coming through this week. The ground isn't frozen across our area, so it's really important that we get that moisture, put it in the ground, and fix that dryness, so we at least have some sort of a profile to work with as we head through spring. I think that would be huge to get this storm system to work for us as we head into this week. But keep in mind, the farther south and southwest you go, the storm's going to work for you. The farther east and northeast you go, I think you're going to get largely shorted out of this deal. I'll obviously keep in touch with you guys. Obviously, let me know if you have any questions. You got my email, you got my phone number right there. Please hit that up if you have any questions or concerns. But if I don't hear from you, I'll be seeing and talking to you again as we head into January of 2024. Have yourself a Merry Christmas, everybody, and we'll be chatting with you soon.